If, like me, you were aware early in the pandemic that COVID-19 was primarily a disease of the elderly, the obese, and the immunocompromised, and that it had a low fatality rate, then I have a foolproof way for you to absolutely own the next person who tries to tell you that there was nothing shady or contrived about the global public health response. Simply show them this video of Bill Gates speaking in May 2022.
It wasn't until early February when I was in a meeting that experts at the foundation said, there's no way, there's been too much travel without diagnosis for us to contain this. And then at that point, we didn't really understand the fatality rate. We didn't understand that it's a fairly low fatality rate and that it's a disease mainly of the elderly, kind of like flu is, although a bit different than that.
Here we see Mr. Vaccine himself admitting that COVID is not a disease that poses a danger to most people. Yet he's claiming he did not know this in early 2020, as the flames of COVID hysteria engulfed the planet, fanned in no small part by him and other elites with ties to government and big pharma. To the credulous fool who would attempt to argue that in March 2020, our governments and their financial backers were simply responding to a potential crisis with imperfect knowledge and hedging their bets against catastrophe, and that the manifold, unnecessary and tyrannical measures they employed and the millions of lives and livelihoods they destroyed were simply an unfortunate price to pay, then just play them that video. Show them Bill Gates claiming that he and his buddies had no idea at the outset of the pandemic that COVID had a low fatality rate and primarily affected only the elderly. And then ask them one simple question. If I knew these things in April 2020, then how come Bill Gates didn't? If I knew these things in April 2020, then how come virtually every government in the Western world, with the exception of Sweden, didn't? The next part is invariably amusing, and you'll enjoy watching the person's brain break in real time. First there's a pause, then a bunch of scoffing and chuckling and obfuscation as they frantically try to reassemble the paradigm that you've just shattered. Then comes some bumbling, waffly justification, and then potentially anger, as they realise you've completely clowned them and they must suddenly confront the possibility that everything they thought they believed was a lie. In all seriousness though, I'm not suggesting you set out to clown people, unless they've called you a far-right conspiracy theorist or a crazy anti-vaxxer or a Nazi or some other cringy pejorative. In that case I say go for broke. But you can, and you should, pose this problem to anyone who is still attempting to prop up the establishment's shabby and thoroughly debunked narrative. Indeed, I was chatting with a friend some months ago, not a government shill by any means. In fact, a staunch opponent of authoritarianism, whose family immigrated to the West from communist Poland. But she was inclined to take a charitable view and give the authorities the benefit of the doubt, rather than giving credence to my view that the global response to COVID constituted a deliberate and nefarious exploitation of a manufactured crisis to shunt our societies down the path of authoritarian technocracy. We were discussing the lockdowns, which were by then into their second year. I had been openly speaking out against them since their inception some 12 months earlier, and trying to explain to anyone who would listen that they were unwarranted, ineffective, and would cause more collateral damage than the virus itself. My specific argument had from the beginning been that the virus had a low fatality rate and primarily affected the elderly, obese, and immunocompromised. Harping again on the subject, and particularly incensed at the sheer lunacy of the situation, given that it was by then common knowledge that the lockdowns had not only failed, but also caused untold suffering to millions of people. My friend responded to me, I guess maybe they weren't in possession of all the facts in the beginning, and they were just doing what they thought was right at the time, or something to that effect. I immediately retorted, so what you're saying is that I, an absolute nobody, knew more about COVID in April 2020 than all the world's governments. She had nothing more to say after that. And whether one's intent is to silence, shame, or simply move one's opponent closer to enlightenment, the blunt unassailability of this juxtaposition will do the job. There is no answer to this riddle other than the unavoidable logical conclusion that the elites of the world, the politicians, their big pharma backers, and the globalist technocrats like Bill Gates, all knew, just as I and many others did in April 2020, that COVID was a virus with a low fatality rate that primarily affected the elderly. They knew, and they fabricated an avalanche of propaganda to terrify their populations into accepting the dissolution of their democracies and the removal of their civil and human rights. And why would they do such a thing? The simplest answer is usually the correct one. Indeed, they did it because they wished to enslave the people of the world through the dissolution of our democracies and the removal of our civil and human rights. There has been ample evidence available since the beginning of the so-called pandemic that this virus was comparable to the flu for most people, not fatal in the vast majority of cases, with virtually all fatalities involving one or more comorbidities, such as advanced age, obesity, diabetes, and other illnesses. The obvious strategy in such a situation is to do what we've always done with relatively mild illnesses: isolate the sick and those most at risk of getting sick, and let the rest of the population go about its business. Indeed, many prominent physicians put their signatures to just such a call to action in October 2020 in the Great Barrington Declaration, linked in the description. Our governments were in possession of all this evidence and chose instead to do the opposite and isolate the healthy, not because they thought they were doing the right thing, but because the course of action had been predetermined as a means to a diabolical and inhuman end. The credulous will argue, no, it's simply that they were listening to the wrong experts and followed flawed models. Really? All of them just happened to get it wrong? The US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, France, Italy, the list goes on. There weren't any outliers. They all just got it wrong? Yeah, okay. And not only did they all get it wrong, but they railed ferociously against those who tried to present evidence that contradicted their chosen course of action. Again, not the actions of those who are just trying to do what's right. But all this aside, again and again it comes back to one inescapable fact: that I, a random guy on the internet, unknown, unfunded, and unconnected, I knew with certainty by April 2020, from having examined the first couple of months' worth of data from around the world, that COVID would pass through the world's population, leaving the vast majority of us unharmed. If I was in a position to be certain in this knowledge, then so were all the people who rule over us. And as such, their actions must be seen for what they undoubtedly were: an authoritarian power grab of staggering proportions that makes the Reichstag fire look like a common street hustle. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. Please also subscribe to my Substack at jjdawson.substack.com. And if you'd like to keep in touch, please do follow me on Twitter at RealJJDawson. You can also follow me on Getter, Gab and Minds. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it about, because it really helps me out.